Psychology and Alchemy this week on Animus Air. Oh boy, I'm excited. Now, maybe you don't care about alchemy so much, but I do know you care about changing. I do know that you may have some procrastination issues, some issues with perfectionism, anxiety, avoidance, and we're going to relate all that to alchemy. How this medieval practice of trying to turn lead into gold, how that relates to you and your procrastination, how understanding the alchemical process more will help you understand what's going on in your own psychology, because ultimately that's what was going on in alchemy, is a projection of the alchemist's psychology. We'll get to it. Yeah, it's just I think this topic of alchemy, it's kind of abstract. It gets tossed around a lot, but I think it's super important, and we can make it super concrete and relevant to you and what you're going through, whatever that happens to be. So let's get to it. Of course, animusempire.com/schedule. Do free 30-minute consultations. I got a question I'll probably answer next week on Animus Air. What I wish I would have done in my 20s. I've got questions like that before, and I think it's not a wrong question to ask, but I think the question misses the point. What I would have done in my 20s, it's irrelevant. I did what I needed to do. But if I really had to nail it down to one thing I would have wished I done, it would have been reach out more. Reach out and connect. Here's an opportunity to do that. animusempire.com/schedule. Free 30-minute consultations. I will point you in the right direction, whatever that direction is. Outline for this show, this podcast, this presentation, part 1 will be context. Isn't that always part 1? Well, it's important. It's understanding context is important for maybe these more abstract topics that I think don't need to be abstract. Okay, I already said that. Part 2, methods and symbolism. I wanted to break that section into 2 sections. First, methods, then symbolism. But methods and symbolism, when it comes to alchemy, are too intertwined. So I'm just going to present them all to you at once. We're just going to throw a bunch of information in that section, and then we're going to wrap it up in part 3, examples. Some modern day examples of alchemy. Oh yeah, we are still engaged in alchemical processes. Not with metals, right? Why? Because we understand metals. That may be one of the reasons, but there are other things we don't understand, so we project our psychology out onto that, and it may have something to do with your neurosis there. Then part 4 will be takeaways, how we can use all the lessons from alchemy to really give you a better perspective, I think, on your neurosis, whatever it happens to be. Procrastination, waking up in the morning and do 2 hours of math homework and you just get lost on YouTube. What can we learn in this lecture to help you with that? I think we're going to learn a lot. All right, part 1, context. What is alchemy? Medieval practice of transforming lesser metals into gold, notably lead into notably gold. Sure, but what? How did you come to this? Why would people start doing this? Well, first of all, who are the alchemists? I mean, I think that's in any movie. Let's see, what's a famous movie that deals with the Middle Ages? Oh yeah, Robin Hood, Men in Tights. You know, like the witch living in the tower, and she had all these potions and everything? That would be the alchemist for a king. The alchemist would develop potions, and there was real chemistry going on, like distillation. But in their spare time, the alchemists, and maybe not even in the official laboratory, that's what we're going to get to, and there may be psychological reasons for that, maybe the alchemists in their own time would work to develop a practice by turning lead into gold. And why they were doing this? Well, you know, a lot of alchemists, when you go back and read their writings, not that I have, that's why we have Jung. Alchemy is the bridge from religion to psychology. We'll get to it. Jung is the bridge from alchemy to a more concrete understanding of alchemy, because he's going to go back through and read all these medieval alchemists and cross-reference medieval alchemists. Thanks, Jung. Yeah. Thanks for doing that. I'm not going to be the one to do that, so thank you. And a lot of the alchemists knew that they really weren't turning lead into gold, literally. They knew they were doing something psychological, though they couldn't really quite know what. And maybe this seems weird that somebody would do this, but we're going to get to it in the modern day example section. We still do this today. And I'm sure you still do this today. I know I do. Why would I? Because it helps psychologically. Because it helps psychologically to have a perhaps impossible task to work on. And it was really interesting because, so alchemy, you could say, is a precursor to chemistry, sure, and I think it is to some degree, but I think it required something like alchemy to get something like chemistry. We had a first turn towards these. Look, I mean, there was real chemistry going on. Again, like I said, the distillation, but it took the real development from the alchemists to eventually get something like chemistry, like Mendeleev, which we'll get to. And so what was alchemy trying to do? Well, here is the Christian problem taken from paragraph 24. This is in Psychology and Alchemy, Volume 12. The tremendous paradox implicit in the insistence of original sin on the one hand, and the concession made by probabilism on the other, is, for the psychologist, a necessary consequence of the Christian problem of opposites. The reality of evil and its incompatibility with good cleave the opposites asunder and lead inexorably to the crucifixion and suspension of everything that lives, and this practice is only possible up to a point. So what's Jung talking about here? There's this process of change that we all need to go through in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, towards the beginning of the Enlightenment. All we had to explicate this psychological process is, at least in the Western world, we'll get to other parts of the world, but at least in the Western world, is Jesus on a cross suffering. Well, this doesn't really help us. How does this really help us to change? There's a more nuanced process going on here, and it took alchemy. It took a projection of this unconscious process out onto metals for us to better understand what this process was. First, we had to project it out there in metals, turning lead and gold, to better internalize it later on. So that's how alchemy emerges, right? Christ as a symbol of transformation was ultimately insufficient. I mean, I would argue, as a non-Christian, I would argue that it is correct, but insufficient. Correct symbolically, insufficient psychologically. And also psychological alchemy, I mean, look, you had to adhere psychologically to the church. So a lot of alchemy was persecuted psychologically. So you had to project it out onto the substance, onto these metals, and that's how you would practice it. I mean, look, due to the mind-body dichotomy inherent in Christianity, how do you reconcile opposites? That's what we were talking about in this previous quotation. How do you reconcile opposites? Right? Well, just suffering. Vague suffering. And even then, the solution only occurs in another world. That's not really helpful. Alchemy is as much of a psychological issue as it is a physical, and this is taken paragraph 342. Tam ethike quam physicae. I think that's the restored Latin pronunciation. It is as much ethical, psychological as it is physical. So, look, we can see that they knew enough about chemistry, especially later on, that you couldn't really turn lead into gold, but we still had to undertake this process, this very much archetypal process, this unifying archetypal factor of the unconscious mind, and project it out so you can better understand it. And we do this all the time. We'll get to it. Do this all the time today, I mean. And this alchemical process is necessary. I mean, this is what I talk about all the time. Like, how can you have reason without regulation? Reason without regulation is just rationalization. If you think you're being reasonable and you have unmanaged anxiety, well, all your reason, quote unquote, is going to do is just rationalize your anxiety. It's just going to be rationalization. And, this is Jung's, I think, great discovery that I think gets misinterpreted and makes people think that he's a mystic or anti-reason. He is definitely not. He's just saying reason is only a piece. Well, and maybe it's a really important piece, sure, but it's only a piece. We need something more stabilizing that provides a great foundation for the reason. I would call it regulation. Jung would call it a religious experience, and that is going from believing to knowing. There's religion. Religion was helping us with that, but there was just too much dogma there, and we had to get away from the dogma to understand what religion is really saying. And this is the importance of alchemy. It was really a transition from religion to psychology. And of course, what's the issue with the Western man, according to Jung? Not that he doesn't experience God necessarily, God as the God image, but he experiences God outside of him, not in his own psyche, not in his own soul. And what this essentially translates into is, that quotation that's super lame but totally true, is longest distance in the world is the one between the head and the heart. How do you go from believing something to just truly knowing it, just to your marrow? This requires a psychological process. This requires alchemy. And so this is the overall, this is where alchemy takes place in just the history of these kinds of studies. First, there was Gnosis, which is just a vague spiritual mysteries that we really don't know that too much about. I mean, it really started in ancient Egypt, and it kind of transferred to the Pythagoreans, but they were just a cult, ancient mysteries. A lot of it involved, divination. But this was later codified into something that was presentable to everybody, that everybody could understand, and that was religion. But religion, because of the mind-body dichotomy, because it lacks certain nuances, because the religion got confused and thought the metaphors they were talking about were literal, it didn't explicate this archetypal psychological process. So that's why we needed alchemy. And then from alchemy, we can look at what the alchemists were doing psychologically, and then from there we can get a proper understanding of psychology, which is really just an elucidation of the gnosis or religious process. We need to explicate what's going on in religion. I mean, this is, I may talk about this later, but what does Jordan Peterson say, right? Bear your cross. No, that was the fault of religion, that it only came around and said, look, Jesus suffering on the cross is all you need to know. Again, that may be figuratively true, but it doesn't explain the process we need to go through. That's where alchemy comes in. And just some more context. This is volume 12, published in 1944. So what this really means at the point of this writing, Jung has his theory figured out. He knows what he's saying. He's talking about the collective unconscious. Now he is presenting more evidence. Now he's just validating these theories more and more, and this is what the work during this time in his life represents. And how did Jung get into alchemy is, well, he reads Secret of the Golden Flower, I think introduced him by Richard Wilhelm, and also translated by Richard Wilhelm. And he noticed similarities between that and medieval alchemists, and then he was noticing similarities between alchemical symbolism and symbolism in patients' dreams. Of course, patients, some of them were barely literate, so they were definitely not, nobody was going back and rereading alchemists from the Middle Ages, let alone some of these patients. Plus, he understood projection by this point, and he started to read the alchemists, and he's like, oh, these guys aren't stupid. They know some of them maybe did think that they were literally turning lead into gold, but most of them knew that that's not what they were really doing. There was something else going on. And the ultimate goal of psychology and alchemy is to transcend the pleasure principle. And this is what separated Jung from Freud. I think I tweeted today that Freud says to endure the pleasure principle. Jung says to go beyond it. In order to go beyond it, we have to delineate the process precisely. And we may get some clues on what this process is by going back and learning about alchemy. So part 2, methods and symbolism. I'm just going to throw a bunch of ideas at you, then wrap it up with some examples and takeaways. I mean, if some of this seems disconnected, well, it's because most of alchemy is disconnected. I mean, there were a lot of overlaps between different alchemists, and they were definitely talking with each other and exchanging ideas. But, some of this may seem a little abstract, but that's okay. I think it's all going to make sense towards the end. This is a difficult topic to deal with. Just as an aside, I mean, alchemy is one of those things. It could be like an 8-week course, an 8-week, 8-hour course, but no, like a 3-year course. Really, it's easy. It best presented as a 3-year course, or in 30 minutes. I'm gonna opt for the 30 minutes. If anything, I want you to get just some really practical information from alchemy. But if you are interested in this, I want you to just really stimulate your psychology, stimulate your intellect, so you think, oh, this might be cool to go and research on my own. And you'll find that there is way more there than I'm sharing with you, but it might not be too relevant if your main issue is confronting girls or confronting other men or overcoming procrastination. All right. Well, one thing to keep in mind when it comes to alchemy, this is figure 142, famously from Psychology and Alchemy, is if you're going to transform, well, there's going to be a specific pattern to the transformation. This is the proto-hero's journey. An alchemist, like I said, they discovered distillation. And they looked at, okay, if we can turn a grape juice into wine or wine into spirits, then maybe there's something that, there's a way that we can change our psychology and make it as, make the end product of our psychology as different as wine is from grape juice. And all we had to do is put grape juice through the specific process to get this wine or the spirit. Then maybe we can do the same with our psychology, with turning lead into gold, literally, figuratively, almost doesn't matter at this point. But the point is there's a certain process through which we can do this. Yeah, after psychological alchemy, your mind will be as different as it was previously as wine is from the grape juice. So that's one important idea. I mean, this isn't just people putting things together haphazardly. No, there is a specific process, and they are delineating out the process exactly. Another important concept in alchemy is the prima materia. This is chaos. This is the starting point. This is the process, essentially, of going into, you can't get gold just by focusing on the gold. You have to look at the starting point. You have to look at the chaos of the lead, step into the problem, so to speak. Is there even a problem? I think implied in the prima materia is there is no ultimate problem. And without looking at the source material, any kind of transformation cannot happen. And a lot of the alchemy isn't focusing on the gold so much. I think that's key. And that's something I talk about. You can't just decide to be happy. You can kind of convince yourself that you're happy in the short term if you decide hard enough and you got enough sleep. But that doesn't necessarily make you happy. The happiness is the result of focusing on the prima materia. It's focusing on what's going on right now. And then focus on that well enough, you put the ingredients in the right order and you interact with them in the exact right way, then you may get something like metaphoric gold, happiness, or individuation. Then there's the Philosopher's Stone, is represented by square in the circle. Hey, you want to let people know that you're really into depth psychology and alchemy and weird esoteric stuff, is you get a Philosopher's Stone tattoo. Oh, man. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to get a tattoo, get a Beavis and Butthead tattoo. What are you doing? Anyways, beside the point. So this is representative of the 4 elements, not just the transformation process, but the thing that transforms. The Philosopher's Stone is the thing that shows up at the end of looking at the prima materia, organizing the prima materia in the exact right way, applying the right pressure to it, physical, chemical, psychological pressure to it, and then at the result of that, you get the Philosopher's Stone, that thing that will then go on to turn lead into gold. So this is the, squaring the circle. The square represents Earth. The circle represents the heavens, higher, lower, Ouroboros. How that interacts with the squaring of the circle. That is how you get the Philosopher's Stone. And we're going to take this apart a little bit. So another way of saying squaring the circle, of course, is Jesus on the cross. And there's this whole section in Psychology and Alchemy about the lapis Christ parallel, how the lapis came to represent a more psychologically nuanced view of what Christ represented. The Philosopher's Stone is just the next iteration of Christ, what that represents. And of course, this is true as the mandala. Same thing. Yin and Yang. I mean, this is what Jung got from reading Secrets of the Golden Flower and other texts from the East. But the Yin Yang. I mean, this is masculine, feminine, or feminine, masculine. Excuse me. Say it respectively. Earth, heaven, wet, dry. Right. It's just the combining of these ultimately irreconcilable forces, but it gets animated through the Ouroboros. So of course, what does that represent, right? You have to, like we talked about the Ouroboros a bunch, you have to, in a sense, digest yourself. How do you reconcile these supposedly irreconcilable things? As you need to digest a part of yourself to animate this relationship between the yin and the yang, between the earth and the heaven, between your unconscious and your conscious, and the way that these interact. This from this process, you get something akin to the Philosopher's Stone, Christ, or individuation. And Tao, right? This goes to Taoism. Tao is the method for reunited these, what's been separated. This is how you do it. Hey, I got these two irreconcilable things. Okay, well, you got to animate it through the Ouroboros, through digesting yourself. The Jesuits, they get to the East, they get to China, they see Tao. Jesuits are great salesmen, by the way. They see Tao and they're like, oh yeah, you mean God. Oh yeah, we totally agree. No, we believe in the same thing. You just mean God when you say Tao. Here, I'm just going to go around and change everything in your books. No, we totally agree. What are you talking about? The light is uncovering the darkness, and it's constantly moving, constantly changing, constantly animated when you swallow your own tail, when you digest yourself, when you receive psychological nutrition by digesting old, outdated parts of you. Metaphor abound. And this is a kind of similar representation of the same thing, but the spiral of the snake around the egg. And of course, the egg representing the cradle point. So it's, you just go around and around the snake swallowing its own tail. You do that over and over again, and you get closer and closer to the creative point, which is the egg, which of course represents the lapis, the Christ. So this, of course, symbolizes, man, you just got to keep working at something. You have to keep. Now, it seems like sometimes you're beating your head against the wall, but you got to keep doing that and keep applying different iterations of it. They do make the point that the way that the snake revolves around this central creative point is a little bit different each time. So different iterations done in a bunch of different ways to get at this creative point, i.e. the egg. And then there's a bunch of symbolisms for masculinity. I'm just going to pick out Thoth. I'm really not sure exactly how to say that, Thoth, but this is the Egyptian god. It represents the logos. This is Apollo, books, recorded history. I mean, this is supposedly, according to Egyptian mythology, this is what Thoth did before the flood. Is he recorded everything that happened. And it's about integrating this with Hermes. Hermes or Mercury. The symbol, again, just for not lower parts of you, but just more unconscious parts of you. Maybe a little bit more base. Just this mysterious transformative substance this eros, right? This spirit, this breath. Thoth is boring. He needs to be invigorated by something. And what what better symbol for invigoration is that? Sorry, guys, I'm still in 7th grade. And, this is where we get something like nofap, which we're going to talk about later in the common examples, present day examples of alchemy, is spilling the cup of Hermes, right? What are you really talking about when you're talking about the cup of Hermes? Obviously. And also it indicates how alchemists had to, be in a particular psychological state. That was a huge part of alchemy. It wasn't just focusing on the external materials, but they had to put themselves in a particular psychological state in order to do the work of alchemy. And part of that was not spilling the cup of Hermes, so to speak. And then another symbol that keeps coming up is the opus. I mean, this is just Latin for work. It symbolizes everything. So we have the dragon here, we have squaring the circle, we have masculine and feminine, we have sun, moon, we have a bunch of different symbols, and these all kind of just put them together. And when we put these substances together in the right way with the right psychological state, maybe we haven't spilled the cup of Hermes for the past couple of weeks, then we're able to create the Philosopher's Stone. And of course, I'm going to reference Harry Potter. What happens in Harry Potter? In the Sorcerer's Stone in America, but in England it was Philosopher's Stone. That's how lame Americans think philosophy is. Like, we wouldn't even like Harry Potter if it was the Philosopher's Stone. That has to be Sorcerer's Stone. That's way cooler. But what happens? Harry gets to the point he's there with what's his name, Voldemort, and the potions teacher, or it wasn't potions teacher. That was always Snape, right? Dark arts teacher. I forget his name. But he's doing all the right things. He's doing all the right things to get to this one place, and then he applies the right pressure psychologically. He's in the right place psychologically, and then what happens? The stone shows up, but Harry had to make himself ready for it. Harry had to put the certain psychological pieces in place, and then this thing that transforms psychological lead into gold will just show up. All right, and so part 4, examples. Here's some modern days examples of alchemy. I already referenced it, but this, the nofap thing. This is spilling the proverbial cup of Hermes. And it's interesting because what do guys say when they talk about nofap and what it does to them? Oh, I just feel so energized. I feel so invigorated. Look, I typically look like David Beckham on the left, but now I look like David Beckham on the right. Like, this is how you think you look. But where does this come from? Is there a real physical thing going on here? Well, probably not. There's been a lot of research on what masturbation really does, if it really, quote, drains your energy, drains your chi. There's really no evidence that it supports it. But does that make nofap silly? No, wait, what have we been talking about? Just because you can't literally turn lead into gold doesn't make alchemy silly. What are you doing to yourself by starting something like nofap? Okay, you're starting to plan your day out. You're looking at distraction traps that you get into. So maybe you don't do that as much. Maybe you, God forbid, maybe even look at the issue that causes you to masturbate in the first place. Oh, I feel a lot of shame around girls because that one girl rejected me when I was 16. Okay, now I have to start looking at that. I'm going to start talking about that. So are you really giving yourself more literal energy by not masturbating for a few weeks? Well, no, but that doesn't mean that you're not putting yourself in this situation that can be very beneficial. I mean, you're just analyzing your life now from a completely different perspective, and in the analysis of your life comes the real gold, comes the real Philosopher's Stone from alchemy, not the fact that you have more chi levels because you haven't jerked off in a while. It's always funny if you just search FAP and NoFap, you'll get a bunch of images from guys who are like, this is me before 30 days of NoFap, and then after 30 days of NoFap, and they think they look totally different. It's just like, to everybody else, they look exactly the same. But no, you think you look different because you're in a different psychological state. And again, I'm not saying to not do NoFap. I think it's a great thing to do. It's a great challenge. But let's be clear what you're really doing. And this is true with, not just NoFap, but anything vibrational, energy, psychology. Oh, you got to work on your vibes, getting crystals, CBD oil, right? This is the West Coast Witch. Now, we may figure something out one day. We may be able to measure people's energy and how doing certain things can change the energy that your body radiates. Maybe this will be a thing one day. I don't know. Who knows? But what's really important is that you are now like doing things to improve your life. You're actively doing something to improve your life, even if it's going to the hippie shop and getting a few crystals. I'm sure it's way better than what you were doing. So it can still be helpful. But the problem is, right? I mean, this is what South Park is making fun of. The problem is like there's almost no problem to taking the metaphor as literal truth, except when you start to apply the literal truth, what this crazy lady does. Cherokee hair, tampons, right? Kyle's really sick. Now he needs something that's really going to help him. So the psychological benefits are important, but we got to be honest about what's going on. I see this all the time. Alchemy is alive and well in history, in studying history, and there seems to be this fight around people, especially what is called alternative archaeology and alternative explanations for, famously the pyramids. Now, just my layman's perspective on this is, I think to really understand the pyramids and how they were built and what they meant, I don't think anybody, unless we come up with like a completely new investigative device or a way of investigating these things, I don't think anybody's really going to know. This is mostly a projection. I think this is a huge mystery. It's mostly a projection of our own psychologies. But in fighting for the past, what we're ultimately fighting for, I would say, is our own unconscious and our own claim to our unconscious. And it's like when people argue about these things, it's like they're not even arguing about what the pyramids were for. Just as an example, they're arguing about the restrictions around the research in the pyramids and who can be published and who can't be. Now, it doesn't mean there isn't some truth to, hey, there may be an alternative viewpoint to history. I'm totally open to that. But when you really find people getting psychologically animated by these topics, you have to ask yourself, well, maybe that there's some sort of alchemical process that they're putting themselves through. Are they really talking about their pyramids, but are they just talking about the importance of humanity to express itself and claim its own past, however you see it? Okay, what's more important? Whether we really figure out the history of the pyramids and how they were built and who built them and whether they were really tombs or some kind of church used for ritual. Right? That's almost beside the point when it comes to people really fighting for their own voice. Right? And you see these bumper stickers, who rescued who? What's the alchemical process here, right? It's paying attention to your dog. Okay, now you have a dog. What do you need to do? You got to take it out every day. Okay, now you're walking more. Okay, now you're communicating with this thing. Now you have to get more in touch with your emotions to communicate with your dog, because your dog only understands emotions, doesn't understand logical arguments. So you're tuning you're the tuning fork, and you got to polish yourself up first before you can really communicate with your dog. So then we get this idea of who rescued who. Well, no, you really rescued your dog. But in you trying to communicate with your dog, just like the alchemist trying to communicate, so to speak, with the metals, they are doing something psychologically positive. Sorry. And then, just any relationship, any business relationship or any personal relationship or any business, anything that you get into, I mean, to get into the place with somebody where you can really communicate with them, even somebody who you're compatible with. And I'm not just talking about a husband-wife relationship. I'm also talking about a mentor-mentee relationship like in Kingpin. I mean, just to get two humans on the same frequency, so to speak, and really communicating, they got to work at it. And it's about the work that they need to do. And there's a great line from Kingpin, which is why I chose it. Also, I chose it because it's just got to be one of the stupidest movies of all time. But God, I can't help but laugh. I mean, just scenes like this when Randy Quaid, and in this scene, Randy Quaid's talking about it. So he's he's Amish, right? And I forget the guy on the right's name. Jeez. Anyways. He's being mentored into becoming a professional bowler, but it's seen at the end that, hey, I was trying to mentor you into becoming a professional bowler. I was trying to mentor you into somebody who could compete in bowling, but really what was going on was I was mentoring myself. Right? And the service I was providing to you was ultimately service to myself. It doesn't matter about the other person so much. I mean, that does matter as a temporary projection of our psychological issues. But ultimately, that other person in any relationship, personal or business otherwise, they just serve a projection as a temporary projection, which is again totally useful. People often say, so in some instances with some people, I think it's really important to start talking with your parents in a more honest way to get your own issues managed. And people often have the excuse that, I can't talk to my dad about certain issues because he's not going to get it or he's too tuned out. And it's really important to keep in mind, it's not about communicating with your dad, or it's not about your dad understanding what you're saying so much. That's not the point. If that was the point, it can't be the point because your dad's just a projection of your own issue anyways. It's about how well can you communicate with your dad. Oh, he's not going to get it. Yeah, it doesn't matter. This is about what you need to do to communicate, and getting in line, doing whatever you need to do to get your emotions in line so you can get to this place where you can communicate with your dad in the best way. This is part of any mentor-mentee relationship. How do I communicate to this kid? In all the effort I'm putting into communicating to this kid, I'm really realizing I'm getting my own stuff handled. Yeah, can you really communicate with your wife fully? With your girlfriend? I don't know. I mean, I think in some instances you can. There's just sometimes this brief overlap of, awesome communication. And it's not really about that happening. It's not that you need that to happen to have a great relationship. It's getting yourself to that place where it's more likely to happen. And that's what alchemy is all about. And of course, the hero's journey. I'm talking about Harry Potter and now Kingpin. I mean, this is from paragraph 440, but Jung basically says, so the hero's journey is maybe you could say the next iteration of alchemy, or some kind of step in between alchemy and psychology. It's the descent into the unconscious to retrieve what is valuable. And this is especially true when we're watching a movie, when we're watching Harry Potter, and we're empathizing with what he's going through, even though obviously we don't have literal philosopher's stones falling out of our pockets. We're not in Hogwarts yet. We can still empathize with what he's going through. This is, in a sense, alchemy. All right, now takeaways. What does this all mean to you? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is conflict is necessary. You need to put the certain materials in place, and they need to be in conflict to create something like the lapis, the Christ, the philosopher's stone. I mean, this is the problem with so there's a problem with Christianity. You put Christ up on a cross, he's crucified, he suffers, but it's not explicated. What's the explanation? That's not really conflict. It's not nuanced conflict. It's just telling you that conflict's happening. But then you have the opposite, which is Buddha, where he was just meditating under the Bodhi tree for 20 years and there was no conflict there at all. That's why he had to get up and do something. Right? No change is going to happen without some kind of conflict. People say, oh, like I feel this push and pull between who I want to become and who I am, or who I was 5 years ago and who I want to be in 5 years. That's really what the push-pull is. Who you were 5 years ago versus who you're going to be in 5 years. Oh, I'm just in the constant state of conflict. Like, good. I'm glad you are. That's how you change. But you can't just go through the conflict. It must be not endured, right? But just accepted consciously. Then it totally changes. It totally changes meaning when it's like, oh, I know exactly what I'm doing and I'm doing it. Like, okay, if you're going to lose weight, you got to be hungry. Now, if nobody's told you that and you're hungry, then it seems like a huge deal. Oh, I'm hungry, I got to eat. But if you just accept the hunger as part of the weight loss and you become more comfortable with it and the anxiety that it causes, then, you're probably going to be fine in 15 minutes. Go take a walk. I think it's also Alchemy speaks to the importance of just putting materials in place, and you can't really make it happen. All you can do, like I always say, you got to get yourself to the proper psychological place from which change is more likely to happen. But are you in direct control of that change? No, you're not. You can change a lot, but when it comes to direct control, some of it may not be up to you. But you put the proper materials in place and you let it happen. Jung famously said, I don't make myself, I happen to myself. You are in charge of the process indirectly, but not directly. So what you have to do is put yourself in a certain situation, put the certain pieces, the alchemical pieces in place. Notice the conflict that comes up when these pieces are in place and endure it. Go through it consciously. Not endure it, probably shouldn't use that word, but accept it consciously. A lot of these symbols of alchemy, like this one, another one I chose here, just like a bunch of symbolism, just all kind of coming together at once. I mean, this is what the opus, this is the magnum opus. A bunch of symbols all kind of coming together at once. You have male, female, you have the eagle. I think there's like a lion's tail there. There's a Ouroboros, there's a snake. Yeah, you got to put all these things together. Your Animus, your Anima, the Ouroboros. These supposedly irreconcilable parts of you just got to put them together, bring them all up into awareness, and then the change, the philosopher's stone, the lapis, it just appears, it happens. I think alchemy speaks to the importance of going into the darkness. And this was a picture of a medieval alchemist studio or lab. I forget where, but it was discovered recently, and they only discovered it recently because it was underground. And so a lot of these alchemists, so yeah, it was the witch from Robin Hood Men in Tights. So she had her official lab, then she had her unofficial lab, and the symbolism there is, of course, you gotta go down before you can go up, right? Jean Valjean. You gotta step into the problem. This is dark night of the soul. What's the point of the dark night of the soul? To ask yourself, what do I need? What do I need in my life so the next time this happens, I'm not so bummed about it? Is there even a problem? Right? That's another way of looking at this. Is there even a problem? I mean, there's the prima materia, sure, but that's not necessarily a problem. You may have certain symptoms like procrastination. That's not a problem. That's just a signal to work on something. That's not necessarily a problem. Oh, I don't know what I want to do with my life. It's such a problem. No, it's just a signal. It's just a starting place for, more inquisitive questioning. That's all. Yeah, there is no problem. Said everything on the previous slide I was going to say on this slide. And this isn't some feel-goodery, oh, everybody's fine the way they are. But no, when we really look at your psychological issue, there really isn't a problem. There's just something to integrate. There's just some signal to what's going on, some clue that gives us an indication of what's going on in your psychology, and then all we got to do is integrate it. It's fine. Stop thinking there's a problem. There really isn't a problem. Alchemy is a great reminder of this. And then there's the separation, the separazione, and the conjunctio. You got to separate out the parts of the transformation and put them back together. Okay, Christ dying on the cross, that may be 100% true, figuratively. But we got to figure out exactly what's going on. You know, the paradox here, of course, Jordan Peterson tells you to sort yourself out. I mean, this is really sorting yourself out, but at the same time, he tells you to bear your cross and thinks that's a explanation for what you need to do. You got to take this psychological process of change or break it down to more fundamental parts and then work on those parts. Forget about the stone. Forget about the lapis. Forget about the Christ. Work on those parts. And then the lapis, like Harry Potter, it will appear. And ultimately, I think, how do you solve an unsolvable conflict? That's really, because what is alchemy? It is unsolvable. That's what these guys are doing. Trying to solve this unsolvable thing. And alchemy answers this. Like I was just saying, continue to work on it, and then something happens. The conflict, the separation, the conjunctio, you separate out the parts, you put them back together. Animated all through the Ouroboros, through digesting yourself. And then something happens. Maybe not, you don't make something happen necessarily, although you do indirectly, but something that may feel like something happens to you, and then you outgrow it. I mean, really think about what it's like to be an alchemist. To go into the studio every night, your lab every night, and really try to turn lead into gold. And you never got upset about it. You never got, exacerbated by the problem. You just kept working on it. Okay, that doesn't work. Okay, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to keep doing something else. I mean, the amount of psychological effort that you would put into that would be phenomenal. And how you would change as a result of that would be phenomenal. And I would submit that something like your relationship with your father, for instance, it's no different. It's the same exact thing. And here we have Mendeleev. Right? So alchemy, in a sense, was its own answer. How do you turn lead into gold? I mean, you didn't get that answer necessarily, but you outgrew the problem. By focusing on these materials for centuries, you eventually gave rise to something like, real chemistry. Some guy going into a shed and just organizing everything out, all the basic elements out over a long weekend. Alchemy answered itself, eventually. But what's the separation? Right? What pieces do we need to focus on? I would submit. Anxiety. This is, I think, perhaps a next iteration, just as a possibility, of the alchemical process. Of what these separate pieces are and how we can put them back together to create the veritable philosopher's stone. This is how our emotions work. This is what we were trying to do the entire time. Anxiety and anger. And I'll leave it there. Thank you. Have any questions? Animus@animusempire.com. Schedule free consultations. animusempire.com/schedule. And I'll leave it there. And wish you, of course, all the joy and pain that comes from really transforming yourself into your own Redeemer.